where they're turning most of the resources to this part of the globe. It is I would like to mention that we got attendees from the United States, from Liverpool in Britain, and obviously from all cities in Australia. So welcome to all the attendees. We're going to listen now to one of our keynote speakers, Comrade Duncan McFarland from the CPUSA. He is currently chair of the China-Vietnam Subcommittee of the Peace and Solidarity Commission of the CPUSA. He was an anti-war activist in the 60s and first visited China on a US-China friendship tour in 1981. He became manager of the China Exchange Delegations Program and editor of the US-China Review. From 2008 to 2017, he was coordinator of the China Discussion Group at the Center for Marxist Education in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In 2021,
hosts CP Australia and also CP Britain and the other countries who made this discussion possible. So I assume you can hear me. Let me know if there are any problems. The title of my talk is The Biden Administration's Imperialist China Policy and the Taiwan Issue. I want to address the topic with 3 points. 1, what is the Biden administration's China policy after 1 year? 2, how effective is that policy? 3, the Taiwan issue. Number 1, what is Biden's China policy? Biden's policy is essentially a doubling down of the aggressive strategy of seeking global hegemony, which means a strong anti-China component, as China is its main perceived long-term rival and adversary. While, given the Ukraine events, Russia may become a prime adversary in the shorter term. The Trump administration launched a trade war, which hasn't worked very well. While some damage was done to Huawei mobile phones and Xinjiang cotton, China's basic economic and international trade position today continues to be overall strong. Biden shifted to a full spectrum attack on human rights and an ideological and propaganda war focused on false and extravagant claims about genocide of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Both administrations have tried to block China's acquisition of high technology, its access to computer chips, and sales of 5G equipment. Both administrations have continued provocative displays of air-sea military power in the South China Sea, even with risk of conflict or war. Biden may have left himself an out if there is a change in approach as he articulates rhetoric upholding one China. However, he continues actions to support Taiwan independence, which oppose one China, and says he is against a new Cold War while actively pushing it. How do we explain this basic continuity of US imperialist policy towards China? The weapons manufacturers and the military-industrial complex profit immensely when there is a fearsome enemy, thus acquiring expensive new weapons systems is a necessity. The colossal sums appropriated by the US Congress to the military machine mean big profits for Wall Street banks. And neocon analysts at right-wing think tanks are pleased to identify China as a principal enemy. We need to look at strategy towards China in a larger context. The so-called Biden doctrine depicts a historic global struggle between democracy and autocracy for the defense of freedom and the future of the world. The US presumes to consider itself as the leader of the democracies and also defines what is a democracy. The question for the US is, do you support us? There is no consideration as to whether any given country is actually democratic or not. This hypocrisy is obvious to the global South and many other people. Biden envisioned improving on Trump's go-it-alone approach to build a US-led so-called grand alliance of the so-called democracies to defeat the autocracies in fierce competition to ensure the free world and stop China's growing malign influence. To this end, Biden hosted a summit for democracy in December, a Zoom conference attended by 111 countries, the supposed democracies. Of course, China and Russia were not invited. Biden hoped this meeting would boost forward a practical collaboration. However, there has been little follow-through in action. How effective is the Biden doctrine on its own terms? Well, you could say it seems to be working well in the countries of the Anglosphere, but not effective globally. So if you look at the Anglosphere, Biden has consolidated political support. In the US, both Democratic and Republican parties are united in the anti-China policy. Congress passes huge military budgets and China-bashing legislation with overwhelming votes. In civil society, in the US, liberal mainstream media outlets such as the New York Times and CNN lead the attack on human rights with constant negative messaging night and day. US public opinion has shifted from positive on China 10 years ago to 2/3 negative today. The way in which the US ruling class can shape public opinion through its control of the corporate mass media frightens me. Meanwhile, racist incidents of harassment and violence against Chinese and Asian Americans keeps increasing. There was a recent stabbing of an Asian American woman in New York City, for example, murder. Outside the US, AUKUS, the new military agreement among the US, Australia, and the UK, will provide nuclear-powered submarines to Australia and enhanced military technical cooperation among the three countries. AUKUS is a major strategic, military, and political move by US imperialism to contain China's power in the region. It is also a bonanza for US weapons contractors. In the UK, the US pressured London to ban China's 5G technology and equipment, claiming it could be used for spying. All the Anglosphere countries, including Canada, embrace the propaganda line weaponizing human rights. But what if we look more broadly outside the Anglosphere? While the NATO countries are still subservient to the US militarily, the Biden doctrine is not so popular even among allies and friends in the European Union. For example, Germany, along with France, have explored a more independent foreign policy in the Ukraine crisis. Biden's call for a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics did not catch fire. It was basically a flop. Even close allies like Saudi Arabia and Egypt sent delegations. So where's this alliance of democracies actually operative? If you look at the global South, we see that the majority of people and countries want cooperation on critical issues, such as the pandemic, climate change, and preventing a major war. This is common sense. The majority of countries and people around the world reject a global framework of division and US-led fierce competition. It's neither just nor in their self-interest. Most countries support the trend towards a multipolar world and against hegemony. China's framework of win-win diplomacy and community for a shared future are much better suited for the increasingly multipolar world. US media continually portrays China as increasingly isolated internationally, but that is not true, especially in the global South. For example, Iran and China are now implementing a 25-year cooperation agreement. Syria and Argentina recently joined the Belt and Road Initiative. And the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in November announced joint China-Africa production of 400 million doses of COVID vaccine. Thus, on a global scale, the Biden doctrine is mostly not popular, not effective, It goes against the multipolar trend of the times. So where does this leave us? 3 more years of the imperialist Biden doctrine, which is bound to lead to constant tension and risk of conflict. That's not an appealing prospect, especially since there's little resistance in the US, either among progressive politicians or even the peace anti-war movement. Our job is to help build that resistance and the no Cold War movement in the US and also internationally. So, Taiwan. I was asked to say something about the Taiwan issue. While the media portrays this, at least in the US, as this very difficult and intractable issue, actually it's easy to understand in principle. US aggression is 99% the source of the problem, and the path to resolving the problem is simply that the US has to actually implement the agreements it has already made, namely the Shanghai Communique of 1972 and the joint statement upon establishing diplomatic relations of the US and PRC in 1979. To help understand the Chinese perspective today, recall a few basic facts of history. China was long a presence in the South China Sea, and the Qing dynasty gained control of Taiwan from the Dutch in the late 17th century. However, the Qing was defeated by Japan in the War of 1894-95, and Japan annexed Taiwan into its growing empire. During World War II, as Japan was being defeated, the Big Four Allied leaders, that is Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, and Chiang Kai-shek, met and considered the post-war period in Asia. Taiwan would be returned to China by Japan. Everybody agreed. When the United Nations was formed in 1945, China was a founding member of the Security Council, and it was assumed that Taiwan was part of China. No one, including the US, ever thought otherwise. But things began to change when the Chiang Kai-shek-led Kuomintang progressively lost the China Civil War of 1946 to 49, being defeated by the communist-led Red Army. The Kuomintang fled to Taiwan Island after being militarily defeated on the mainland. After the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, the US sent its 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Straits to protect Chiang Kai-shek. Most observers believe without US military backing of the KMT, the Kuomintang that is, the Red Army with local support would have eventually taken control of the island. China has never accepted the legitimacy of the US military intervention in the Chinese Civil War. And it is this US intervention that created the different governments on the island and the mainland, and it is the root of the problem. But China, this is an important core issue because it deals with territorial integrity and national sovereignty. Ever since the Opium War of 1840, the Western colonial and imperialist strategy was to break off bits of the empire one by one to weaken and overthrow the Beijing government. For example, the British occupied Hong Kong and had a concession in Shanghai. Germany and Japan had a concession in Shandong province. Russia and Japan exerted control over northeast China or Manchuria. Britain tried to seize Tibet. Russia annexed considerable territory in China's northern borders and Xinjiang. Japan launched a full-scale invasion and occupation, costing more than 20 million Chinese lives. Once again, today, China sees foreign warships on the southern coasts, just like the British during the Opium War. Today's imperialist pressure on Taiwan, as well as Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang, has to be seen in this historical context. Both Foreign Minister Wang Yi and China's President Xi Jinping in recent speeches have made reference to the so-called century of humiliation, when China was a victim of colonialism and imperialism. Those who want peace in the US must repudiate the 1950 US military intervention. So to fix this problem, the solution is clear. All that needs to happen is for the US to fulfill the terms of the Shanghai Communique. The US simply has to do what it has committed to do in writing. That is, cut back on military support for Taiwan, stop high-level official visits, stick to established protocols, don't support Taiwan independence activities, and recognize in word and deed that the People's Republic of China is the sole legitimate government of China. All business, educational, and cultural activities can proceed as usual. Instead, Biden has violated diplomatic agreements with China, such as by officially inviting to his inauguration the top Taiwanese envoy in the US. Sales of military equipment to Taipei have continued, and the US has pushed for Taiwan's participation as an independent country in international bodies like the World Health Organization. There are continued displays of military force in the South China Sea, but China will not back down on the Taiwan question. This is the one place where China, in my opinion anyway, will fight if pushed too far. And here there is a risk of a shooting war. It is the responsibility of the US to change course and fulfill its obligations according to the agreements it has signed. So in conclusion, we can probably talk about things to do and so forth during the discussion period. But I would just like to say that I hope that all the progressive people's movements and organizations join in a popular front against a new Cold War, US militarism, racism, and white supremacy, and offer an alternative agenda of economic development, global cooperation, and peace. Thank you very much.